Hey painting friends, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to do a beginner level acrylic painting tutorial of a nice little walk through the forest. We have a little forest pathway here with some pretty purple flowers. So we're using acrylic paints here. We have black, yellow ochre, primary yellow, sap green, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, burnt umber, magenta, dioxazine purple. We also have like a wine red color. We have a crimson red, titanium white. We also have like a bright green color there as well. I can't remember the name of that one at the moment. But we start by mixing that bright green with some white, a little bit of burnt umber, just to cool it down a little bit. And we just start by making these back and forth brush strokes on the canvas. This is a small canvas, it's just 6 inches by 6 inches. So that made it easier to get this little painting done in less than 30 minutes. So I'm adding a little bit of white here to my palette and a little bit of primary yellow, and I'm starting to brighten that up, and I make my back and forth brush strokes at the top of the canvas all the way across, mostly focusing on the right side and then bringing those back and forth brush strokes down until they meet with that first color I put on the canvas and give like a nice smooth little blend there. Kind of misty off in the distance, so that's what this is. This paint is for that like misty background where we start to lose things and they go out of focus. Added more of that bright green, a little bit of my yellow, and a little bit of burnt sienna just to warm that up some more. And now I'm starting to add some little leaves and branches, and I'm just very lightly pressing on the canvas here, holding the brush at different angles so I can get different little shapes for the leaves. Not focusing on any individual leaf shape, just kind of scribbling with the paintbrush and trying to get the appearance of jagged little edges for leaves in the background. Now I added a little bit more green there, and my leaves are getting larger as I'm moving closer to the foreground. And I'm continuing those little shapes that are just kind of all over the place, just pushing the paint around with the brush and trying to get different little shapes. I'm using a flat tipped brush here. You're welcome to use a round tipped brush. The flat tipped brush is going to give you a little bit more of those jagged edges that you see in these little leaves. Again, brightening it up a bit more and starting to add more little leaves in the background. These ones are a little bit smaller and they're starting to fade a little bit farther out into the distance. Again, just holding the brush in different ways and different angles, trying to just let that paint plop onto the canvas without really pushing it in there too hard. I just want that paint to just glide over top of the layer that's already on there. Blended a bit more of my cool greens, a little bit of brown in. Adding a little hint of purple in there as well to cool down my green. And we have some more leaves that are in shadow. Just continuing that same process, creating little clusters of leaves. I add all these leaves first, and then we go back and we start to add some branches. That's when everything starts to tie together. So we're adding a little bit more of our dark green and some brown, continuing to we're using less and less white as we move closer to the foreground, and that's making things get darker and it's going to give us more contrast. That's how we start to create a sense of depth in our painting. Now I'm taking a little bit more of that cool green in my yellow. Just gonna darken up a few of these leaves on this side. And now we're ready to start creating some branches. So I'm switching to a liner brush here. This is a long, thin paintbrush. You can use this for painting any type of line, for grasses, for tree trunks, tree branches, stuff like that. And I have a link to those in my description section under this video if you need to get some liner brushes. So for the liner brush, the trick is to water down the paint a little bit so that you can get a nice detailed line. if you don't water down the paint, you're going to get like a jagged line with like a textured look. So you want to water down that paint a little bit and then just very lightly press the brush to the canvas and drag it down just softly and swiftly to create those little tree branches. You can also use it to make leaves like I just showed. I'm just kind of pushing the brush back and forth, just layering on top of other little sections, and it's good for creating smaller little leaves in the background. I mixed a bit of purple in there, watering it down, also mixing in some burnt umber, and we're going to start to add some more branches. So this tree is a little bit closer to the foreground, has a little bit of a thicker trunk, and it's got some nice little branches coming off of that main trunk. You can put your branches wherever you'd like. Just make sure they all kind of come off of one main trunk whenever you're painting them. And I'm just starting to add a couple little branches in there that you might catch, your eye might catch as you're glancing through the landscape, but it's not a critical part of the landscape. I'm using my liner brush to add a couple little leaves on this section in the background. Mixing a little bit of my yellow ochre in here with my bright green and some white, creating a nice little highlight green. And this is going to be my base color for all of the ferns and the little bushes in the foreground on the lower left. So it starts kind of in the center of the canvas there, and I'm just creating those little spots. Here I'm adding a little shadow over those first, just carrying down some of those little leaves and branches just to connect the two. And then we go back to our larger brush and we start to fill in some of this white space with these bushes and ferns in the lower left. Adding a little more of that green in my ultramarine blue and some burnt umber just to cool that green down. And we're just going back and forth here and just completely covering up this section. Just getting a good coverage of paint, making little crisscrosses with my brush. And I'm pressing a little harder on the canvas here just to make sure all that paint gets on there pretty good and I get nice good coverage over the white. It's starting to build up a little bit darker with more blue and green in the very front foreground lower left corner, just to keep pushing some depth into the painting. And I'm starting to work on that on my right as well. Cleaning off my brush and then dipping the brush in my napkin just to get the excess wet water off of there. And now we're going to work on the path. So I just used some of my burnt sienna, my titanium white, and my burnt umber. And I'm continuing to warm that color up with a little bit more of my burnt sienna. And we just get a good base color here. Go all the way from your green on the left to your green on the right. You don't want to leave any white space here. Grab a little more paint if you need to. I mix a little bit of black in there, maybe a hint of my purple, just to make some of that warm color go away as I'm pushing this path farther back into the distance. There we go, just covering up all the white on the canvas. So now we have a good base layer completely covering the whole canvas. Don't have any little white spots. Starting to blend some of my browns together. And we're going to create a shadow here for our little steps. We have little rocky steps on this path, and this part is in shadow. So your lines for your steps are going to get thinner and a little bit closer together as they're going farther back into the distance, and that helps to create the sense of depth and distance in your painting. Here I'm taking a little bit of my purple, and I'm just starting to add a little bit of a shadow color right along the edges where the path meets the trees and the bushes. Cleaning off my brush again. And we're back to the liner brush here. I'm mixing my brown, my purple, and a little blue. A little bit more burnt umber and some black just to get a nice cool dark shadow. And I'm wetting it down with my water just to get a good thin down paint so I get a nice line. And now we're going to paint some of the branches that are closer in the foreground. And we have these nice pretty, I don't know if they're rhododendrons or if they're azaleas, but they're these pretty purple flowers that have really like twisted looking branches that come around them. So we're working on those twisted branches now. You kind of just wiggle your brush around to create those little curves in the branches, and you can add branches wherever you want. Just make sure that as your branches are getting farther away from the base, they're getting thinner, and your curves are getting a little bit smaller as they're getting farther off into the distance, and that your line is getting thicker and a little bit darker at the very base of your trunk. You can let your little branches overlap like I did here. Also helps it carry off into the distance. So here I'm thickening up the branches at the base. Taking a little more blue. And adding a couple more little branches in there. To make it look like a true forest, you gotta have like a good layering of branches and trees. You can't just have one tree in the foreground and then some leaves in the background, or else it doesn't read properly. So you gotta make sure you add your little branches, kind of starting up in the foreground and making their way into the background. Using more black for this big thick branch right in the left corner there. This just really adds that depth to your painting because now you have this big thick branch right in the front, and your branches are getting thinner and less dark as they're going farther back into the background. So that's how you're creating a nice little sense of depth in your painting. Still using my liner brush here to continue creating more little branches coming off of my trunks. If you make a little mistake, it's okay, like I just did there. Easy fix. Add another little limb right there. Here I'm just adding a bit more of a shadow to the base of this trunk, since the base is a little bit more in shadow and the things closer to the top of the painting have a little bit more of a highlight in them. Now I'm using that same color of the black with a bit of brown to create a stronger shadow on the rocky part of the path. We have our little rocky steps. And I'm not completely filling in this whole section with shadow. I'm kind of building up the shadow, outlining the rocks a little bit. just to keep creating that sense of depth. And things should get a little bit less dark. You can start to add a tiny bit more white in, or you can start to water it down a bit as you're going farther back into the background with these little shadows. Adding a hint of green onto my tree trunk there for some moss. Now I'm blending a little white on my canvas, adding some water to it, and just adding a couple little highlights on these branches, just brightening things up where some sunlight is peeking through all of the leaves overhead and lighting up some of the branches. For this section, you just want to make sure your little highlights are closer to the top part of your canvas, and you want most of the highlight to be on the top part of the branches, not on the underside of the branches. Adding a few more leaves in this corner, just using my liner brush with lots of green, blending a little ochre, adding some water just to give a little highlight to some of our little ferns down here. Kind of warms up the scene a bit more too by adding that ochre. Taking a little more of my blue and some of my sap green, a little bit of black, and now we're going to add some shadows for the ferns that are closest to the foreground, making these shadows get a little bit less saturated as they're moving farther back just by pressing lighter on the canvas and pressing a little harder and getting a little bit more of that dark paint in the foreground sections. Now I'm using some more of that bright green color that I was using before, and I'm just starting to use my liner brush, dragging the little brush strokes out, starting with pressing a little bit more firmly and then picking up the canvas to create each little individual fern branch look. So I start by pressing a little bit more firmly and then picking up the brush as I make each little swoop. That's what gives us that kind of triangular long branch look. And I'm continuing that for this whole section, just for each little fern area. Taking a little bit more of my white blended in there, a little bit of ochre too, and just starting to create a couple little pockets where the sunlight is peeking through. Using my liner brush still, taking a little more brown. And continuing to add another little highlight on my branches to make my branches look a little bit less flat. Adding a highlight and a shadow to your branches gives them more of the round appearance and makes them look less like they're just a two-dimensional line painted on a canvas. And now I'm mixing some of my purple, my red, and a tiny little hint of white in there, just to brighten it up a bit so we get a little more pigment look. And I'm starting to add a couple of my little flowers. So I start with the shadow color, and then once I get these little shadows built in, then I'll start to add some highlights on top of that with the nice magenta color. So I'm taking that magenta here and just adding that right on top of some of my little highlights that I put in there. I could have made these flowers here even smaller than I did. If you make your flowers in that section small and your flowers closer to the left side of the canvas larger, that also is going to help you with your depth in the painting. But you definitely want to have a little highlight and a shadow underneath your highlight in each of these flowers. And some of your flowers are mostly just going to be in shadow, and some of your flowers are going to have more of a highlight on them. Some of them are even going to have this brighter little highlight where you include more white. You want to have a good little variety in color and highlight and shadow for your flowers. And you want to make sure you're not evenly spacing your flowers. So here I guess I made these guys a little smaller. That helps. That helps it look more realistic. So when as you're placing your flowers, make sure you're not perfectly evenly spacing them out. You're gonna have some flowers that are like almost on top of each other, and you're gonna have a gap area where you don't see any flowers. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to have them perfectly spaced. You don't have to have them all the exact same shape either. Some of them can just be a one single blob of paint, and other ones can have little spikes for each individual petal you can start to see. Some of them are gonna be more open and have a different shape. And you can make your flowers a different color if you'd like as well. I liked the magenta color because it's still kind of a cooler red. Thought it was a nice contrast with our green. Here I'm blending some white with my magenta and continuing to build up the highlights on some of these little flowers. So as you can see, some of these flowers are super bright and have more shape for each individual petal, and some of them are more in shadow and have a little bit less detail. That helps to make the painting come to life a little bit more. And once we finish adding these little shadows and highlights to the flowers, then we just have a couple more touches, just finishing up the ferns in the bottom. So here I'm blending a little bit more of my yellow ochre and my primary yellow with some white to give me a brighter highlight for these ferns. I want the ferns to catch some of this light as well. And I've switched away from the liner brush here, and I am using a small flat-tipped brush. So I'm just adding these highlights over some little sections. I'm not completely covering up that whole area. You want to leave some shadow spaces still so that we have a little bit more depth added, and it just looks like we have layers and layers of these ferns. Just making little crisscross patterns with my brush to make it look like we have branches coming out from both sides of a little stalk. Here I'm blending some of my sap green with some purple and burnt umber, and I'm just building up those shadows on the, we'll call it a rhododendron. On the rhododendron plants, we just have some of our dark, cool green leaves around some of these flowers, so I'm making sure I add those in there. And you can add as many of these little leaves as you'd like. If you don't want to add any and you want it to mostly just be flowers, you're free to do that as well. I think adding these leaves like darkened the canvas a lot, darkened the painting. So if you don't want to go too dark and you want to brighten things up, you could add all these leaves and then add more little highlights on them, or you could just put a few leaves in there. Here I'm starting to add some little highlights on the leaves. So just white mixed with some yellow and sap green. Throw in a couple bigger leaves closer to the foreground on that big branch. And then adding little highlights onto the lower right side. And finally we're adding another highlight onto our path. So I mixed a little bit of my yellow ochre, my burnt sienna, my white, and just adding this little highlight right above the shadow at the edge of each of these little rocks. Kind of carrying that highlight over in some spots, making sure my lines are getting thinner as they're going farther into the background and they're thicker in the foreground. And then adding another little shadow here just to make sure I'm getting a good separation between the plants and the path. Have a good little shadow under the plants. Mixing a bit more of my blue and green. Just cooling down some shadows in there. Adding more shadows to the right side of the path, right near the plants, to continue separating the path from the plants. That's basically it, guys. Here I'm just making a couple more little touches, adding a couple more variations of color into the pathway, and then doing a couple minor touch-ups on some of these leaves as well. But in general, this was a pretty quick, easy painting to create. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you recreate this painting yourself, then you can post it on your Instagram and tag me, the Painting Stoof page, so that I can see it. And I'm looking forward to seeing your paintings. You guys can also find more tutorials like this on my YouTube channel, so make sure you hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. You can also find tutorials on my Patreon account. I have a link to that below this video in the description. Thanks for watching, thanks for hanging out with me. Have a great day and happy painting. Bye bye.